The next procedure we're going to review is that of the Dispute Review Board, also known as the Dispute Resolution Board, and often just called the DRB. DRBs were developed in the 1970s as a result of the U.S. National Commission on Tunneling Technology's study on contracting processes. And like many of the other procedures we've looked at, there was a real concern about the amount of time it took to resolve construction disputes using traditional methods, primarily litigation, but even at that time, arbitration. The time between when the problem first arose to the time of getting it before a decision maker was simply too long. There was also a need to look at the real root of the cause of disputes, which is communication problems. And was there a process that could improve communications and address problems before they escalated into major disputes? And the result of the study began the development of DRBs. Another important note on the timeline is in 1996, the Dispute Resolution Board Foundation, referred to as the DRBF, was founded. And the goals of the DRBF are to promote the use and understanding of DRBs and to provide a clearinghouse for experienced and trained neutrals, and also to provide general education to the public and the construction industry about DRBs. They also collect a great deal of data, and you have the readings of their process books, their operation manuals, in this week's assignment. It is important to go through those carefully. A full understanding of the DRBF best practices for using DRBs will be extremely helpful to you in your understanding of how these work and why they're important to the construction industry. The first part of getting a DRB going is the parties' commitment to using this procedure. Once they've decided to incorporate DRBs into the project documents, they have a few things to do before they get to actually drafting those specifications. And the first one is selection of the board. Remember, in most of our other procedures, there's a pre-existing agreement to use arbitration or mediation before the neutrals are appointed. The procedure is a little bit different here. As you'll see in a minute, there's an agreement that is formed after the board members are selected, and that agreement includes the commitment of the board members to the agreement. But let's spend a minute or two talking about the selection of the board. The best practice, as recommended by the DRBF, is that the board is selected jointly by all the parties and all three members are neutral. There are other models where the owner selects one member of the board, the contractor selects the other, and those two get together and select the third, and that third person automatically becomes the board chairman. Whether the parties are using that method or they are jointly selecting all three, obviously the identification of appropriate board candidates is very important. DRBF, as I mentioned, provides a roster of neutrals who are trained in DRB practices. Many of them are trainers of other prospective DRB members as well, and speakers around the world on DRB topics. Other organizations, such as the three ADR service providers we've mentioned before, have many candidates who are also schooled in the processes of DRBs. And as we go through this, remember that just because someone wears the hat of a neutral, that doesn't mean they can wear all the subsets of the hat of a neutral. There are specific skills that are required here that are somewhat different from those of an arbitrator or a mediator. And perhaps it's best described as incorporating the most important skills of both of those roles. You need someone who can be a facilitator, but you also need someone who can be a decision maker and know when to serve in each role. So the parties need to identify a group of board candidates, and then they provide those candidates with the project documents. And like any other neutral, the prospective members must make disclosures. The disclosures, as recommended by the DRBF, are a little bit different. There's similar categories, but one category that's important and should be encompassed by other procedures, but is specifically enumerated here, is if a prospective board member is currently serving on another DRB in which one of the other parties is also involved, or is serving as a neutral in some other capacity with one of the other parties. And again, the typical other types of disclosures: close personal or professional relationships, any financial interests, and any other relationships between the neutral who's being considered as a DRB member and the parties or any of their contacts. Those disclosures are provided to the parties who, again, this is a joint process in most instances, will make a decision as to whether or not the candidate is elevated to a role of a DRB member. There's a confirmation appointment. It can vary depending upon how the parties choose to do it. Usually it's just an agreement and then confirmation back to the board member. And like all other neutrals, there is a specific code of ethics for DRB members that is included in the assigned readings this week, and you should read it. And then finally, if all of the neutrals are appointed jointly, the three of them will get together and select the chair. One point on qualifications. When this practice began in the 70s and 80s, this was an entirely construction industry focused process, and the people who served as DRB members were all from the construction industry. It was not a lawyer process. As you can imagine, and as one of the criticisms with many of the early end dispute resolution procedures, as it becomes more widely used, it becomes more like a formal structured proceeding, and lawyers get more involved. There is great debate as to whether or not lawyers should serve as DRB members. What happens when they do is it's usually like a 3-member panel on a construction arbitration group, and that is the lawyer usually becomes the chair and the procedures become a little more specialized. But again, they're still informal procedures, so even having a lawyer involved does not turn it into as much of an adversarial process as some of the other ADR procedures. But again, this is why it's important to vet the person's skills as a neutral for this job as opposed to their skills as a neutral when they're serving in a different role. So once the board is confirmed, the next step is to enter into what's called a 3-party agreement. There's a sample of the 3-party agreement in your readings, and the primary categories of the information to be included in the 3-party agreement are listed below. What's of note here is that the DRB members themselves, the board members, are signatories to this document. Unlike arbitration or mediation or most of the other dispute resolution procedures where the involvement of the neutral is not a direct contract with the actual parties, here the representative, the owner, the contractor, as well as the 3 board members sign this document. Most of the elements listed here are pretty straightforward, but one thing that's, again, a standout for this procedure is the responsibility of the parties, and the use of the term parties there means the board as well as the contractor and the owner. So there's a section outlining the board's responsibilities to the parties, things like confidentiality and maintaining the integrity of the process, and then the responsibilities of the parties. So again, it's really reinforcing that the parties have signed on to this process, which fosters open communication and early dispute resolution and proper use of the DRB. One of the other elements of the 3-party agreement are the legal relationships, and that's really just clarifying that the DRB members are independent contractors and not employees of either party, and it also usually includes a provision which grants at least quasi-immunity to the board members for any actions that result from their activity as board members. And as DRBs are usually used on public projects, there is also usually a provision that allows the funding agency to periodically review the expenses of the DRB and make sure they're in line with what was intended, but it does not give the funding authority a right to participate as a party in the DRB process. The 3-party agreement should be signed prior to the DRB taking any action. The next step in the process is to have an initial meeting of the board to organize their own communications, discuss how they're going to act during the hearings and what their responsibilities are between any meetings or hearings if hearings are necessary. And then there's an initial meeting of the board and the parties. Like many other preliminary management meetings we've reviewed, there's an established agenda. Here, it's usually the chair of the board that establishes it. There may be some party input But again, these board members are experienced in doing this and have an idea of what should be covered. And again, the DRBF provides a good outline for these procedures. Once the board is in place, they have regular meetings with the project teams to keep abreast of the status of the project. When issues come up, there are two routes to use: advisory opinions and more formal hearings. So let's first look at advisory opinion. The advisory opinion option is the more streamlined procedure for quick decisions, but it should not be used in place of direct negotiations. The parties always should try to resolve their disputes first. They're often using the advisory opinion option when they have tried and have gotten close, but before they start forming official positions, they want some expert input, and that's where the DRB comes in handy. To get an advisory opinion, both parties must agree for this option. If only one party wants to go to the DRB, then they have to use the more formal hearing procedures. Usually the DRB will act on an advisory opinion request, in part because it's made by both parties, but the only reason they're probably going to turn it down is if the issue appears to be so technical or so complex that they're going to need more information. Once an advisory opinion is requested, the chair will establish a procedure. The parties will submit abbreviated position statements and possibly rebuttals, and then the board meets privately in executive session, reviews, and prepares their opinion. Most often these advisory opinions are presented in person. If both parties request, the DRB may issue a written opinion, but usually these are in-person procedures. The parties then can adopt the recommendation, they can continue negotiating, or they can pursue the next level. And that is usually the more formal DRB hearing procedures. And if this is not arising out of an advisory opinion situation and just the parties have a dispute, either party may request a DRB hearing. Again, the chair establishes the schedule. There is a period of time where the parties must try to prepare a joint description of what the dispute is and what the recommended scope of the recommendation is. If they are not able to do that fairly quickly, then the board will probably allow them to each submit that information on their own. Supporting documentation is provided. There may be expert testimony, and it's important to note that a DRB can require that specific experts be brought in either if the parties don't produce them on their own, and that is cost is usually borne by the owner unless the parties have prearranged for this in their documents establishing the DRB and the operating procedures. Then an informal hearing is conducted, and the DRB again resorts to an executive session to review the evidence and make their recommendation, which is called a DRB report. It usually contains findings as to facts that were in dispute or any interpretation of relevant contract provisions. Then the DRB issues its recommendations to resolve the dispute and the reasoning for it, and this is a written report and it is delivered to the parties for review. What the parties can do after that is one of several choices. The parties may go back to the board and seek clarifications. They can accept the board's recommendation, or they can reject it. If they reject it, they can either proceed directly to the next step in the dispute resolution process as per their contract, or they can continue negotiations, or they can do both. If the procedures established create an appeal process or some sort of review by the board, the parties can pursue that. It is rare, and it would be a very expeditious review, usually looking for some sort of obvious error. So that is the general outline of a DRB. Review the DRBF guidelines in detail and understand why this is a very important process on public projects. It focuses on early resolution, improved communications, and having people experienced with the project for the life of the project. That is probably one of the key aspects of this. One other point to note is how to remove a board member, and we'll cover that in a separate presentation.